Great, thanks Keith. Meredith, we're looking forward to your remarks.
Okay, thank you. It's always nice to be able to go last and reflect on everybody's thoughts, but I'm coming at this where I think, based on the experience I've had in 15 years looking at various issues throughout the complex Ottawa River watershed, and Keith already talked about the complexity when you start to bring in multiple jurisdictions, and that's what we've got for sure. But I really think one of the root causes of concern or causes of conflicts over risk is about trust. And I think it's been touched on here, but trust is an important one I want to reflect on. I think secondary is this concept of risk tolerance, risk perception, acceptance, and then I think there's a really important role of communication that we need to improve on for sure. So, when I think about risk, I think about mass confusion in the public, and we can think about thinking about likelihood, probabilities, and I'm thinking a lot about the floods right now. So we're seeing this really large flood happening in the Ottawa River watershed, and we've got historic levels since we started measuring anyway, and people are they can't grasp the concept of return periods of floods. They think if you get one 100-year flood, that's it, you're good for a couple generations and you're not going to get hit again, and if there's two in a row, it's a conspiracy. Somebody has screwed up. You can't blame this. You can't possibly blame this on climate. We already had our big flood. How could we have another one? So that's something that's really difficult for a lot of people in the general public to understand, that concept of probabilities. And then if we think about risk tolerance, I think they're inherently combined with values. It's hard to separate the two, right? So, we all have different comfort levels with risk. And, thinking about, I'm a backcountry skier, so you could have the same snowpack conditions, the same slope, and different skiers are going to choose whether or not they're going to ski that slope or not, depending on their level of tolerance of risk. And that's going to depend on how badly they want that, adrenaline rush or whatever it is to get that peak. We think about things like in the nuclear industry, the guidelines for tritium in drinking water. So you can look at the guidelines in different countries: Canada, 7,000 becquerels per liter; the European Union, 100 becquerels per liter; Finland, 30,000 becquerels per liter; USA. So these are things that really confuse the general public, right? And I'm going to come back to that because I think a lot of it is based on communication. But the general public don't understand, is this uncertainty or is this risk estimation, risk tolerance? So there's backstories behind all those numbers that you have to really be digging into to understand that more and more. So again, that's a difficult thing for people to understand. And then, of course, there's a difference of whether you are choosing to take that risk yourself. I'm going to vaccinate my children, or is that a risk that you have no choice in? I'm drinking water from the city of Ottawa and there's fluoride in it, and I have no choice of whether or not that's in there. So that also impacts people's acceptance on different risk levels. Is it something that they've chosen, or is it something that they have no choice over? So different people have a tendency to over or underestimate risk. That's really important. So on the, what else did I want to talk about? I wanted to talk about this role of communication. So I talked about the tritium and how important it is to communicate the backstory. But another example that I like to use is just the perception of water quality is one example that I came across a lot as the Riverkeeper. So the height of pollution in the Ottawa River was the 50s, 60s. All our cities were dumping their wastewater untreated into the river. All our pulp mills were unregulated. And now we talk a lot about, you know, recreational water quality. Is it safe to swim? And I've had people come up to me and say, you know, this is just awful. I would never swim in the river now. It's so polluted. And I grew up swimming in the river. And I said, oh, well, do you mind me asking where you swam? Oh, Britannia Beach, you know, what decade? Oh, the 60s, that's where we would go. That was the most polluted time in the river. And now that they hear a little bit more about E. coli rates or untreated sewage going into the river, just a bit more on the communication front, they start to think that there's a real risk there. So again, that concept of perceived risk and how you communicate it is really, really important. The building trust thing I've found is of utmost importance and very difficult to do. You can't really do that over a short-term assessment. And I've seen the changes in just Ottawa Riverkeeper's engagement with the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, with Atomic Energy Canada Limited, and Canadian Nuclear Laboratories over the years changed a lot over 15 years, hugely. From the beginning when, you know, here I am, I've got the public who are like, what is going on at that place? I don't trust it, you know. To me saying, okay, well, I gotta figure it out. I gotta be able to find out what's going on there and let the public know. And going to these quasi-judicial hearings was really the only way to do that. And at that time, Linda Keane, who was the commissioner, said, you guys need to figure out, like talking to AECL, you need to figure out a way to start engaging your stakeholders outside of these quasi-judicial hearings. And they started an environmental stewardship committee. And what happened there was something that Keith talked about was this kind of personal relationship piece, and a lot about building trust is about those personal relationships. And what happened there was you start to get to know the individuals. You see that they're very competent, they're very smart, and they're actually well-meaning. They want to, you know, do a lot of the same things you want to do. So over time, you know, you get to develop a relationship where they'll share information, and, you know, you start to trust some of the things that are going on, and that has a huge impact on understanding how, you know, when decisions are getting made, or understanding the difficult challenges that we have always in a lot of these projects. And so the trust piece, I think, you know, Scott talked about the risk estimation, and I think almost everybody could agree, like, we need the complex, highly sophisticated engineers and experts to figure out how to safely store nuclear waste. There's no doubt about it. I can also bring, again, this concept of what we're seeing on the river right now. So do we want, like, the general public who's living beside the river to be the ones who are coming up with our policy on how to manage the dams on the river? I'm pretty sure we don't. But do we want to hear from them on how we manage the river? Absolutely yes, because right now we've got, you know, a group of people sitting around a closed door making decisions that are based on reducing flooding and generating electricity, and they're not listening to a lot of the other voices in the watershed that are important. So, you know, it's important about that risk estimation, who's doing it, but also what values they're incorporating into their estimations. So, I think what we're lacking right now, to be honest, is a sophisticated, trusted political process and our institutions to develop this credible, legitimate strategy. And we see right now where, for the past 4 years, there's been, you know, a huge deliberation around the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act, and we don't even know if that's going to get through the Senate in the next few weeks we have remaining. And a huge part of why that's such a challenge for projects across Canada that are really big and complicated is coming back down to this lack of trust in the process, And lack of trust also, probably a little bit less in terms of risk estimation and but a lot in terms of how the decisions get made. And that's the transparency piece. So I think we could really improve a whole lot if there's a lot more transparency about how decisions are getting made. I think that would really help in terms of understanding the conflicts with experts that Scott talked about that often happens. So if you're transparent about how that decision got made, then which experts are you kind of leaning on and why, and which was more credible and why. And so that's an important piece. But it also will come down to a conflict in values. So how did you make that decision? What values were more important? And as you become more transparent in how those decisions get made, there becomes more trust and then more and more ability to use those decisions for your next ones, to learn, to adapt. And we see that in the courts. The courts are very transparent about how decisions get made. They get used for the next case down the line. So I think that would be a really important piece to improve on the tensions we have around these decision-making things. So I think those are the kind of big points that I wanted to make.
Great. Thanks very much, Meredith. And I'll pat ourselves on the back. So glad that you're here. Those are extraordinarily important views to share, and I'm sure will stimulate a lot of discussion, not only from our discussant, but also from the audience. Mark.